History loves its European legions, those disciplined ranks marching across continents, conquering in the name of empire. But what about the armies that made even the most hardened European military minds pause in genuine fear? What about the warriors who perfected the art of warfare centuries before Napoleon ever drew breath? This is the story of Zwide kaLanga, a man who built the most feared military machine in southern Africa, commanding respect from both allies and enemies across 1,000 miles of territory. Yet this same warrior king would see his empire crumble in a single, catastrophic battle that changed the course of African history forever. Here was a military genius who revolutionized warfare itself, but whose greatest victory became the seed of his ultimate destruction. How does a young prince from a minor chieftaincy transform into the commander of armies that struck terror into the hearts of seasoned European military observers? How does one man's vision of total warfare reshape an entire continent? And how does the pursuit of absolute military dominance ultimately lead to the most spectacular downfall in African military history? This is more than a story of conquest. It's the tale of how the pursuit of perfection in war can become a civilization's greatest weakness. Picture southern Africa in the late 1700s, a landscape of rolling hills, vast grasslands, and scattered chieftaincies locked in an endless cycle of cattle raids and territorial skirmishes. The traditional ways of warfare had remained unchanged for generations. Young men with cowhide shields and assegais fighting honorable battles with predictable outcomes. But beneath this familiar surface, seismic changes were building pressure. Climate shifts brought drought and famine. Population growth strained resources. And somewhere in the northern reaches of what would become KwaZulu-Natal, a young man named Zwide was watching, learning, and preparing to shatter every military tradition his ancestors had known. This was an Africa that European maps barely acknowledged, a continent of sophisticated kingdoms and military innovations that would make Roman legions seem primitive by comparison. The Ndwandwe people, under Zwide's emerging leadership, were about to demonstrate that African military genius could surpass anything Europe had produced. The moment that would transform Zwide from ambitious prince to legendary warlord came during a seemingly routine cattle raid. But what should have been a minor skirmish would become the laboratory where revolutionary military tactics were born. As rival warriors charged in traditional formation, expecting familiar patterns of combat, they encountered something unprecedented, a coordinated fighting machine that moved with lethal precision they had never seen before. That day, witnesses would spread word of warriors who fought like a single deadly organism, commanded by signals so subtle that enemies couldn't predict their next move. Little did they know they were witnessing the birth of military innovations that would terrify European observers and reshape warfare across an entire continent. This is where our story truly begins. The young Zwide kaLanga inherited more than just a chieftaincy. He inherited a problem that would have destroyed lesser men. The Ndwandwe territory sat precariously between more powerful neighbors, constantly threatened by the expanding Mthethwa Confederation to the south and aggressive Nguni clans to the east. Traditional wisdom suggested survival through careful diplomacy and defensive alliances. Zwide chose a different path entirely. From his earliest days as a leader, Zwide displayed an almost supernatural ability to see warfare from perspectives that eluded his contemporaries. While other chiefs focused on accumulating cattle and wives, the traditional markers of power, Zwide became obsessed with studying the mechanics of battle itself. He would spend hours observing how different animals hunted, how wild dogs coordinated their pack attacks, how lions used terrain to ambush prey, how even insects like army ants moved with devastating collective intelligence. But it wasn't just observation that set Zwide apart. It was his willingness to completely reimagine the very foundations of African warfare. Traditional Nguni combat was essentially ritualized. Warriors would form loose lines, engage in individual combat, and retreat when honor had been satisfied. battles rarely resulted in total destruction of the losing side. Zwide looked at this system and saw inefficiency that bordered on madness. His first revolutionary insight came during a border dispute with the Thembu clan. Instead of meeting them in traditional formation on neutral ground, Zwide spent weeks studying their movement patterns, their grazing schedules, even their social hierarchies. When the Thembu warriors arrived at the agreed battleground, they found it empty. Zwide's forces had circled behind them, surrounding their home settlements while the warriors waited for a battle that would never come. This wasn't just tactical brilliance, it was a complete philosophical break with everything African warfare had been. Zwide understood that true military power meant controlling when, where, and how battles were fought. The Thembu, facing the choice between watching their families become hostages or submitting to Ndwandwe authority, chose submission. Zwide had won a war without fighting a single traditional battle. Word of this victory spread like wildfire across the region, but most chiefs dismissed it as a clever trick that could only work once. They were catastrophically wrong. Zwide was just beginning to demonstrate how fundamentally he had reimagined the nature of warfare itself. His next innovation would prove even more revolutionary: the complete restructuring of how armies were organized, trained, and deployed. Traditional African military units were based on family groups and age grades, systems that prioritized social cohesion over military efficiency. Zwide scrapped this entire structure, creating what military historians now recognize as the first truly professional army in Southern African history. He divided his forces into specialized regiments, each with distinct roles that complemented the others. The Horns of the Beast became his signature formation, a devastating pincer movement where flanking units would encircle enemies while a central force held their attention. But the real genius lay in how these units communicated and coordinated during battle. Zwide developed a system of horn calls, shield movements, and even smoke signals that allowed real-time battlefield communication across miles of territory. His commanders could adapt to changing conditions instantly, responding to opportunities or threats faster than any enemy could counter. European military observers who later studied these techniques admitted they surpassed anything in their own tactical manuals. The transformation of individual warriors was equally dramatic. Zwide's training regimens pushed fighters beyond anything previously imagined in African military culture. Warriors learned to fight in perfect synchronization, moving as extensions of a single tactical mind. They practiced forced marches that could cover impossible distances, allowing Zwide's armies to appear where enemies least expected them. But perhaps most importantly, Zwide understood the psychological dimension of warfare in ways that wouldn't be formally recognized by European military theory for another century. He realized that defeating an enemy's will to fight was more valuable than destroying their physical capacity for battle. The climactic test of these innovations came during Zwide's confrontation with the powerful Mthethwa Confederation. The Mthethwa, led by the experienced Chief Job, commanded respect across the region and had never suffered a serious military defeat. Their warriors were seasoned, their tactics proven, their confidence absolute. When Job's forces marched to confront what they expected would be an upstart challenger, they encountered something that defied their understanding of warfare itself. Zwide's army moved like a single organism, responding to threats and opportunities with coordination that seemed almost supernatural. Individual Mthethwa warriors, no matter how skilled, found themselves isolated and overwhelmed by enemies who fought with perfect tactical unity. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. When it ended, the Mthethwa Confederation had effectively ceased to exist as an independent power. More shocking than the military victory was what followed. Instead of the traditional post-battle negotiations and cattle tribute, Zwide systematically absorbed the defeated warriors into his own army structure. This wasn't conquest in any traditional African sense, it was the complete transformation of military culture itself. Zwide had demonstrated that traditional warfare was not just inefficient, but obsolete. Every chief in southern Africa now faced a terrible choice: adapt to Zwide's revolutionary methods or face inevitable destruction. The young king, who had inherited a vulnerable chieftaincy, now commanded the most feared military force in southern Africa. European traders and missionaries arriving in the region sent back reports that struggled to describe what they were witnessing: an African army that moved and fought with precision that European military academies could barely match. But this triumph would plant the seeds of complications that Zwide couldn't foresee. Success on such a scale inevitably breeds both imitation and resistance. Across the region, ambitious leaders were studying Zwide's methods, adapting his innovations, and preparing challenges that would test whether revolutionary military genius could survive its own success. The decade following Zwide's victory over the Mthethwa marked his transformation from regional powerhouse to continental force of nature. His military innovations spread across southern Africa like a virus, but none of his imitators could match the systematic brilliance of the original. While other chiefs adopted pieces of Zwide's tactical puzzle, only he possessed the strategic vision to see how all the elements worked together as a complete system. Zwide's next breakthrough came through his recognition that military power without economic foundation was ultimately unsustainable. Traditional African warfare was essentially economic: cattle raids to acquire wealth, territorial disputes over grazing rights, occasional conflicts over trade routes. Zwide reimagined the entire relationship between military force and economic power. He established what military historians now recognize as history's first systematic military-industrial complex in sub-Saharan Africa. Instead of simply raiding for cattle, Zwide's forces began capturing entire communities, integrating their populations into a growing economic machine designed to support permanent military expansion. Skilled metalworkers, leather craftsmen, and agricultural specialists found themselves relocated to support Zwide's growing war machine. The results were staggering. Within 5 years, Zwide's armories were producing weapons of superior quality to anything available elsewhere in the region. His warriors carried assegais forged from iron ore, controlled by Ndwandwe mining operations. Their shields were crafted from hides of cattle raised on captured grazing lands managed by absorbed communities. Every aspect of military production was vertically integrated under centralized control. But Zwide's most revolutionary insight involved human resources. While other chiefs still relied on seasonal warriors who returned to their families and cattle after brief campaigns, Zwide created the first permanent standing army in southern African history. Warriors in his forces didn't have families or property in traditional senses. They were married to the regiment, fed by the state, and existed solely for military purposes. This created fighting units with unprecedented cohesion and dedication. European observers later compared Zwide's regiments to monastic military orders, but even this comparison failed to capture their unique character. These warriors had been psychologically reconstructed to function as components of a larger military organism rather than individuals fighting for personal or familial honor. The psychological warfare dimensions of Zwide's system proved as effective as the tactical innovations. Stories of Ndwandwe military prowess spread far beyond their actual area of operations. Enemy communities would sometimes surrender rather than face armies whose reputation had grown to mythical proportions. The mere presence of Zwide's scouts in a region could trigger massive population movements as entire chieftaincies relocated rather than risk confrontation. During this period, Zwide's strategic vision expanded beyond traditional concepts of territorial control. He began constructing what amounted to the first continental military logistics network in African history. Supply caches, communication relay points, and forward military bases stretched across hundreds of miles, allowing his forces to operate at distances that would have been impossible under traditional military systems. The sophistication of this network amazed European observers who encountered its remnants decades later. British military engineers found evidence of road systems, supply depots, and communication installations that demonstrated planning and execution capabilities they hadn't expected to encounter in pre-colonial Africa. Some admitted privately that Zwide's logistics network surpassed anything they had seen in European colonial operations. Zwide's expansion during this period followed patterns that revealed his deep understanding of geopolitical strategy. Rather than simply conquering adjacent territories, he targeted regions that would provide strategic advantages: mountain passes that controlled trade routes, river valleys that dominated water access, mineral deposits that could support expanded weapons production. Each conquest strengthened his overall strategic position while weakening potential rivals. The climax of this expansion phase came with Zwide's confrontation with the Ngwane Confederation, led by the formidable chief Matiwane. The Ngwane represented everything that traditional African military power could achieve: experienced warriors, proven tactics, strong alliances, and intimate knowledge of their local terrain. If anyone could challenge Zwide's revolutionary system, it would be Matiwane's proven forces. The campaign that followed became a masterclass in military strategy that European staff colleges would later study as an example of perfect operational planning. Zwide didn't simply invade Ngwane territory. He systematically isolated it. Trade routes were cut. Allied chieftaincies were neutralized or absorbed. Food supplies were targeted through coordinated raids that created artificial famine conditions. When the final confrontation came, Matiwane's forces found themselves fighting not just Zwide's army, but the accumulated effects of months of strategic pressure. Their warriors were hungry, their allies had been neutralized, and their traditional supply lines had been severed. The battle itself was almost anticlimactic, a demonstration of how military genius could make even desperate courage irrelevant. But the aftermath revealed the full scope of Zwide's vision. Instead of traditional post-conquest arrangements, he implemented what amounted to the complete reconstruction of regional civilization. Defeated communities weren't just absorbed, they were reorganized according to military principles that maximized their contribution to Zwide's expanding war machine. European missionaries and traders operating in the region sent back reports that struggled to describe what they were witnessing. They wrote of African military organization that surpassed European standards, of economic integration that created continental-scale resource flows, of social engineering that transformed entire populations into components of a single military system. By 1815, Zwide controlled territory stretching from the Drakensberg Mountains to the Indian Ocean, from the Limpopo River to the borders of what would become the Cape Colony. His military innovations had spread across the continent, adapted by leaders as distant as the kingdoms of present-day Zimbabwe and Botswana. European colonial planners, studying intelligence reports from the region, concluded that traditional European military advantages might not be sufficient to overcome African forces organized according to Zwide's revolutionary principles. The young chief, who had once ruled a vulnerable border territory, now commanded a military empire that represented the pinnacle of pre-industrial African achievement. His innovations in tactics, logistics, economics, and social organization had created something unprecedented in human history: a truly continental African superpower built on indigenous military genius. But success on such a scale inevitably created the conditions for its own undoing. Across the region, ambitious leaders were not just copying Zwide's methods, they were improving on them. And among these competitors, one young warrior named Shaka Kasenzanga Kona was preparing to demonstrate that even revolutionary military genius could be surpassed by someone willing to push the boundaries of warfare beyond anything previously imagined. The seeds of Zwide's downfall were planted in the very success that had elevated him to continental dominance. By 1816, his military system had become so effective that it had eliminated most meaningful opposition across southern Africa. This created a paradox that Zwide, despite his strategic brilliance, failed to fully comprehend. An army designed for continuous conquest must either find new enemies or begin consuming itself. The first cracks in Zwide's empire appeared not as military defeats but as internal contradictions within his revolutionary system. The permanent standing army that had been his greatest innovation began showing signs of restlessness when denied regular campaigns. Warriors who had been psychologically reconstructed to exist solely for military purposes struggled to adapt to periods of peace and consolidation. More critically, Zwide's success had created a generation of military leaders who understood his innovations but lacked his restraint and strategic vision. His most talented commanders, having mastered the techniques of revolutionary warfare, began developing ambitions that extended beyond their roles as components of Zwide's military machine. The emergence of Shaka kaLanga Kona represented the ultimate test of whether Zwide's system could adapt to competition from someone who had learned its lessons too well. Shaka wasn't simply another talented commander. He was a military genius who had studied Zwide's innovations and concluded they didn't go far enough. Where Zwide had revolutionized tactics and logistics, Shaka revolutionized the psychological and cultural foundations of warfare itself. His military innovations built directly on Zwide's foundation, but pushed them to extremes that even the master had never contemplated. The student had not just surpassed the teacher, he had transformed the teacher's revolutionary ideas into something that made the original seem conservative by comparison. The conflict between these two military visionaries was inevitable, but its timing and location would be determined by factors neither could fully control. The population disruptions created by decades of revolutionary warfare had generated massive refugee movements across southern Africa. These displaced communities, fleeing the destruction of traditional social structures, created both opportunities and pressures that would force a final confrontation. Zwide recognized the threat that Shaka represented, but his response revealed how success had compromised his earlier strategic flexibility. Instead of adapting his methods to counter Shaka's innovations, he relied increasingly on the tactics and strategies that had brought him to power. This conservatism, perhaps inevitable after decades of unbroken victory, would prove fatal when confronted with an enemy who understood his methods better than he understood theirs. The preliminary skirmishes between Ndwandwe and Zulu forces demonstrated that both armies had transcended traditional African military capabilities. European observers, watching from safe distances, reported battle techniques and coordination that surpassed anything in their military experience. These were not the savage conflicts that European racial prejudices expected, but sophisticated military operations conducted by professional armies using advanced tactical principles. But the decisive confrontation would not be determined by tactical superiority alone. Shaka had learned from studying Zwide's campaigns that strategic patience and psychological warfare were often more valuable than battlefield brilliance. Instead of meeting Zwide's forces in direct confrontation, he began implementing a strategy of strategic retreat combined with systematic destruction that turned Zwide's own tactical principles against him. The Battle of Kukli Hill in 1818 represented the culmination of this psychological and strategic warfare. Shaka had maneuvered Zwide into a position where victory required the very kind of frontal assault that contradicted everything Zwide had learned about effective warfare. But the psychological pressures of the campaign, the need to demonstrate continued dominance to his own forces, the pressure from commanders who demanded decisive action, forced Zwide into tactical choices his younger self would have recognized as strategic errors. Picture yourself standing on that hillside, watching two of history's greatest military minds locked in a contest that would determine the future of an entire continent. The morning mist clings to the valley below as thousands of warriors move with the precision of a deadly dance. These are not the chaotic clan battles of traditional African warfare, but coordinated military operations that would have impressed Roman legions or Napoleonic armies. The battle itself lasted from dawn until sunset, with both sides demonstrating tactical sophistication that European military observers would later struggle to explain to skeptical audiences. But by evening, it was clear that Shaka's strategic patience had overcome Zwide's tactical brilliance. The Ndwandwe forces, despite fighting with unprecedented skill and courage, had been systematically outmaneuvered by an enemy who understood their methods better than they understood his. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Zwide's military system, built on the premise of continuous victory and expansion, couldn't survive a decisive defeat. The psychological foundations that had held his empire together, the belief in Ndwandwe military invincibility, crumbled faster than the actual military structure. Within months, the continental empire that had taken decades to build was fragmenting into chaos. Allied chiefs switched sides or declared independence. Absorbed communities rebelled against Ndwandwe control. The economic and logistical networks that had supported continental military operations collapsed as local administrators prioritized immediate survival over strategic coordination. Zwide himself, the military genius who had revolutionized African warfare, found himself leading the remnants of his forces in a desperate retreat toward the Drakensberg Mountains. The man who had once commanded armies across 1,000 miles of territory was reduced to leading a few thousand loyal warriors in a fighting withdrawal that would end with his death in exile. But even in defeat, Zwide's impact on African military development proved irreversible. His innovations had spread too far and been adapted too successfully to disappear with his empire. Chiefs across southern Africa continued using variations of his tactical principles. His organizational methods influenced military development as far as present-day Angola and Tanzania. The military revolution he had initiated continued long after its creator had been destroyed by forces he had helped set in motion. The final irony of Zwide's career lay in how completely his revolutionary vision had succeeded. He had transformed African warfare so fundamentally that his own defeat represented not the failure of his innovations, but their ultimate vindication. Shaka's victory was only possible because he had mastered and surpassed the military principles that Zwide had created. The immediate aftermath of Zwide kaLanga's defeat sent shockwaves across southern Africa that would reshape the continent for generations. Within months of the Battle of Gokokli Hill, the military innovations that Zwide had pioneered were spreading faster than ever before, carried by refugees and survivors who had learned his techniques firsthand. The great irony of Zwide's legacy is that his defeat accelerated rather than ended the military revolution he had initiated. Shaka's victory was built on foundations that Zwide had established, and Shaka's subsequent conquests spread these innovations across an even wider geographic area. Chiefs as distant as present-day Mozambique and Botswana adapted variations of Zwide's tactical principles, creating a continental military transformation that European colonial forces would struggle to comprehend. When European armies finally encountered these transformed African military systems in earnest, they discovered opponents whose tactical sophistication and strategic coordination exceeded anything their own military academies had prepared them for. The Zulu victory at Isandlwana, the Ethiopian defeat of Italian forces at Adwa, and countless other African military successes can trace their tactical genealogy directly back to innovations that Zwide kaLanga had pioneered decades earlier. Modern military historians studying Zwide's campaigns have concluded that his tactical innovations were at least 50 years ahead of contemporary European military thinking. His integration of logistics, communications, and psychological warfare created what amounts to the first modern military system in sub-Saharan Africa. Some scholars argue that European colonial conquest of Africa was only possible because internal conflicts between African powers using these advanced military systems had already weakened the continent's capacity for unified resistance. But Zwide's story offers lessons that extend far beyond military history. His rise and fall demonstrates how revolutionary innovation, no matter how brilliant, carries within it the seeds of its own obsolescence. The same principles that allowed him to dominate his contemporaries eventually enabled competitors like Shaka to surpass him. Innovation without adaptation becomes conservatism, and conservatism in a rapidly changing environment becomes a form of strategic suicide. Perhaps most importantly, Zwide's legacy challenges every assumption about pre-colonial African military capability that European colonial propaganda promoted. The man who built armies that European observers admitted surpassed their own tactical standards represents not an exception to African military genius, but an example of innovations that were happening across the continent on scales that colonial historians systematically minimized or ignored. The question that haunts Zwide's legacy is what might have happened if African military leaders had found ways to coordinate their revolutionary capabilities against external threats rather than consuming them in internal competition. The military systems that Zwide pioneered and that Shaka perfected represented indigenous African achievements that could have changed the entire trajectory of global history. When you consider the tactical sophistication, logistical coordination, and strategic vision that Zwide demonstrated, you're confronting evidence of African military genius that colonial narratives spent centuries trying to erase from historical memory. His armies weren't feared because they were savage or primitive. They were feared because they represented military innovation that surpassed anything Europeans had developed. Today, as modern African nations grapple with questions of development, governance, and continental unity, Zwide's story offers both inspiration and cautionary lessons. His achievements demonstrate the heights that indigenous African innovation could reach when freed from external constraints. His defeat illustrates the tragic consequences when internal competition prevents coordination against common challenges. The military revolution that Zwide kaLanga initiated changed African warfare forever, but it also reveals the potential that exists when African strategic thinking is allowed to develop according to indigenous priorities rather than external pressures. His legacy asks us to imagine what contemporary Africa might achieve if it could harness the same innovative spirit and strategic vision that made his armies the most feared military force in the world. What do you think? Could modern African leadership learn from both Zwide's innovations and his ultimate downfall? How might his story change your understanding of pre-colonial African achievement? And what parallels do you see between his challenges and the strategic choices facing contemporary African leaders? If this incredible story of African military genius has amazed you, subscribe to discover more hidden histories that challenge everything you thought you knew about our continent's past. The stories of Africa's forgotten innovators and visionaries are waiting to be told, and they might just change how you see the world.